There is a version of the First World War that has been taught in schools, printed in textbooks, and repeated in documentaries for over 100 years. It features muddy trenches, brave soldiers, incompetent generals, and a tragic waste that eventually gave way to an armistice and a return to civilization. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that go far beyond omission. The parts that were left out were not forgotten by accident. They were filed away, reclassified, quietly buried beneath layers of administrative language and national mythology until they became unreachable to ordinary inquiry. What remains is a story scrubbed clean of its most disturbing truths. Not the blood, which was well documented, not the death tolls, which are cited constantly, but the colder truths. The truths about how the war functioned as a system, how it processed human beings the way a factory processes raw material, how it generated suffering at an industrial scale and then developed bureaucratic mechanisms to absorb that suffering without acknowledgment, without pause, and without any serious institutional attempt to stop. The war did not spiral out of control. That is the comfortable lie. The war ran exactly as designed, and the design treated men as expendable inputs in a calculation that nobody at the top was ever required to personally experience. When historians describe the First World War as unprecedented, they usually mean the scale of destruction. They mean the numbers. 17 million dead, 20 million wounded, entire generations of young men erased from the demographic record of countries that had sent them forward with flags and speeches. Those numbers are correct, and they are staggering. But the word unprecedented deserves a different emphasis. What was truly unprecedented was not the dying. War had always killed people. What was new was the organizational infrastructure built around the dying. The systems for recording it, managing it, routing it through channels, communicating it to families in standardized language, and continuing the operational tempo regardless of its accumulation. The war produced death faster than any previous human conflict, and simultaneously produced the administrative machinery to handle death at that speed. Without the machinery breaking down, men died. Forms were filled. Replacements were requested. The line held. That cycle, repeated millions of times, is the truest description of what the First World War actually was. Most people, when they imagine a World War I trench, picture something recognizable from films and photographs. A long ditch cut into the earth, sandbagged at the top, a duckboard floor, men standing or crouching with rifles. What that image fails to convey is the sensory reality of what those men lived inside. The smell was the first thing survivors consistently mentioned when they tried to describe the trenches to people who had not been there. Not the smell of mud, though mud was everywhere. Not the smell of cordite, though the air was frequently thick with it. What hit hardest was the smell of decomposition, because the trenches were not just positions cut into empty ground. They were cut through ground that already contained the dead from previous engagements. Bodies had been buried in haste or not buried at all, or buried shallow and then disturbed by subsequent shell impacts that scattered remains across the surface and worked fragments of bone and flesh into the walls of the trench itself. Men lived inside what were effectively mass graves. They ate their rations, sitting on the firing step with their backs touching earth that contained human remains at varying stages of biological dissolution. They breathed air that carried the chemical products of that dissolution. Rats moved freely through the trench system and grew to unusual sizes on the available food supply, which included the bodies of both enemies and friends. The rats were not a peripheral nuisance. They were a constant presence that men described not with horror after the first weeks, but with a weary matter-of-factness that itself constitutes one of the most disturbing details of the war. The normalization of that environment happened faster than any behavioral scientist of the era could have predicted, because the alternative to normalization was psychological collapse, and psychological collapse was not operationally acceptable. Men adapted not because they were exceptionally brave, but because the human nervous system is capable of recalibrating its definitions of normal under sustained pressure. What had been unimaginable in August of 1914 had become routine by the winter of 1914 and nearly invisible by 1916. A man could eat his breakfast beside a partially exposed body and feel no particular disturbance, not because he was callous by nature, but because the war had systematically eliminated every other option for psychological survival. The callousness was manufactured by the environment. It was a feature, not a failure, of the system. The British Army's approach to officer selection in the early years of the war produced one of the most consequential and least examined catastrophes of the entire conflict. The assumption was that men of the right social class, men who had attended the right schools, men who had been trained from childhood to lead and to project authority, would naturally make effective combat officers. This assumption was not seriously questioned. It was embedded in the culture of the army and in the culture of the society that produced the army. The result was that thousands of men with no relevant military knowledge, no understanding of the terrain they were being sent to operate in, and no experience of violence beyond what could be learned on a school sports field, were commissioned as second lieutenants and sent to command platoons of working-class soldiers who in many cases had already spent months in the trenches. The average life expectancy of a British infantry officer on the Western Front in 1916 was measured not in years, but in weeks. Some estimates placed it at 6 weeks during periods of intense activity. The death rate among junior officers was proportionally higher than among enlisted men, which reversed the expectation that rank provided protection. It provided the opposite. Officers were expected to lead from the front, to be visibly present during attacks, to walk upright when the tactical situation demanded that every rational instinct screamed to stay down. They died at extraordinary rates, and they were continuously replaced by fresh graduates of the same system. Men equally unprepared, equally doomed, equally committed to performing the role they had been assigned. What the High Command never adequately addressed, and what the official histories have consistently underweighted, is that this slaughter of junior officers represented not just a human tragedy, but an ongoing operational disaster. The constant turnover of platoon and company commanders meant that unit cohesion was perpetually disrupted. Men who had built trust with one officer were rotated back to find a stranger in his place, often within weeks. Institutional knowledge at the tactical level, the knowledge of specific terrain features, the idiosyncrasies of particular sectors of the line, the location of unmarked mine craters and unrecorded enemy positions, could not be accumulated because the people accumulating it kept dying before it could be transmitted. The war ate knowledge as surely as it ate bodies, and then demanded that the same mistakes be made again by the next rotation of men who had no way to know they were being made. The medical infrastructure constructed to support the British Expeditionary Force was in many respects a remarkable achievement of organization and logistics. Casualty clearing stations, field ambulances, base hospitals, hospital ships. The entire chain of evacuation was designed to move wounded men efficiently from the point of injury back through the system toward recovery. The design was sound in principle. In practice, during major offensives, it broke down in ways that were systematically concealed from the public. During the first days of the Battle of the Somme in July of 1916, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties in a single day, including nearly 20,000 dead. The medical system had been designed to handle the optimistic casualty projections provided to the planners. Those projections were wrong by a factor that rendered the entire plan of evacuation functionally useless. Men lay in shell craters and in the open ground between the lines for hours, for entire days in some cases, before anyone could reach them. Men who might have survived with timely intervention died of blood loss, of shock, of infection that set in before any treatment could begin. The surgeons in the clearing stations worked without pause for days. They operated on improvised tables in tents that shook with the concussion of ongoing artillery. They made triage decisions under conditions that no training had adequately prepared them for, decisions about which men were worth saving and which men should be set aside because the resources required to save them would consume time needed for patients with better odds. These decisions were not recorded in any form that made their full scope visible. The medical records of the war, when they were kept at all, described procedures performed, diagnoses made, outcomes achieved. They did not record the men who were left outside the tent. They did not record the conversations between exhausted surgeons deciding in 30 seconds whether a man with a sucking chest wound had enough remaining function to justify the effort. The system processed what it could process and left the rest to circumstances that nobody was required to document. And the men who survived to give testimony about what they had seen in those clearing stations were for decades discouraged from discussing the details publicly, both by the social expectation that soldiers did not dwell on weakness and by a more explicit institutional pressure to maintain a narrative of effective care that bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. Shell shock is a term that most educated people today recognize as an early description of what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The recognition of the term does not mean that the reality behind it is well understood, because the history of how the British, French, and German armies dealt with shell shock reveals something about institutional psychology that goes far beyond the treatment of an individual condition. In the early months of the war, when men began appearing at aid stations with tremors, paralysis, mutism, blindness, and hysterical reactions that had no apparent physical cause, the initial response of the medical establishment was denial. The symptoms were real, but they were attributed to physical causes, to the concussive effect of nearby shell explosions on the nervous system, which is where the term shell shock originated, because the assumption was that there must be a physical explanation for what appeared to be psychological damage. When it became clear that men who had never been near an exploding shell were presenting with identical symptoms, the physical explanation became untenable. What followed was not a compassionate reassessment. What followed was a debate about whether these men were cowards, malingerers, or simply constitutionally inferior. The language used in official correspondence about shell shock cases during the middle years of the war is striking in its clinical contempt. Men who could not speak, men who shook uncontrollably, men who had lost the ability to walk without any wound to their legs were assessed for weakness of character. They were subjected to treatments that would in any other context be described as torture. Electrical stimulation applied to paralyzed limbs by physicians who believed that if the pain of the treatment exceeded the comfort of remaining ill, the patient would choose recovery. Some did, some did not. None of them were consulted about the basis on which they were being treated. The numbers of shell shock cases were never accurately reported during the war, because accurate reporting would have required acknowledging the scale of a problem that the High Command did not want acknowledged. A man diagnosed with shell shock could in theory be removed from the line and treated, consuming medical resources and reducing the available fighting strength. A man described as having cold feet, as lacking moral fiber, as simply needing discipline, could be returned to the line. The incentive structure within the medical system pointed firmly in the direction of underdiagnosis. Doctors who worked close to the front were under explicit and implicit pressure to keep men at the line or return them to it as quickly as possible. Men who pushed back against that pressure could find their own careers affected. Men who complied became, functionally, instruments for returning damaged human beings to an environment that had damaged them. Some of those men were returned to the line and killed within days of their return. Some broke down again more severely. Some were shot for cowardice, which brings us to one of the most carefully managed silences in the entire history of the war. Between 1914 and 1918, the British Army executed 306 of its own soldiers following courts-martial for offences, including cowardice, desertion, casting away arms, and striking or showing violence to a superior officer. For most of the 20th century, those executions were discussed in official contexts with a careful neutrality that declined to examine the individual cases in any serious detail. The men had been convicted by courts-martial, the process had been legal, the sentences had been reviewed by commanders up the chain, and that was the end of the discussion. What the official narrative chose not to examine was the context in which those courts-martial had occurred. Men were tried for desertion who had been in continuous frontline service for months without rotation. Men were tried for cowardice who had already survived experiences that by any objective measure should have killed them. Men were tried for striking a superior officer who had themselves been struck, humiliated, and denied any institutional recourse for conditions that no animal in a civilian context would have been required to endure without complaint. The courts-martial were not conducted with significant procedural rigor. Defendants were often not informed clearly of the charges against them. Legal representation was minimal or non-existent. The entire process was completed in some cases in less than an hour. Men were shot at dawn the following morning. What makes the executed men particularly significant is not the number, though the number is significant, but the selection. Analysis of the cases in the decades after the war revealed that the men most likely to be executed were those with the least social capital, the fewest connections, the most marginal position within the military hierarchy. Commissioned officers were almost never executed for equivalent behavior. A junior officer who broke down under fire and ran was far more likely to be quietly removed from the line and given a medical category than to face a court-martial. An enlisted man who did the same thing was far more likely to be shot. The application of military justice in the First World War was not uniform. It was calibrated by class, by rank, by the availability of anyone willing to speak for the accused. The men who were shot had nobody to speak for them in the rooms where decisions were made. The full scale of the artillery used in the First World War has been described in numbers so large they lose their meaning. During the preliminary bombardment before the Battle of the Somme, the British fired approximately 1.5 million shells over 7 days. During the Third Battle of Ypres, commonly known as Passchendaele, the combined artillery of both sides fired so many shells into the Belgian lowland that the drainage systems beneath the surface of the ground were destroyed, turning the battlefield into a swamp that swallowed men and horses and machinery, and which created conditions that artillery planners had not anticipated and that senior commanders refused to acknowledge were affecting operational outcomes. Men drowned in shell craters filled with water and mud. Not poetically drowned, not metaphorically drowned, but physically drowned. Their heads going under the surface of liquid mud in craters whose walls offered no purchase, their equipment pulling them down, with nobody close enough to reach them. This happened not once but repeatedly, and the reports of it moved through the chain of command in the form of casualty returns that listed the cause of death in administrative language that did not require anyone reading the form to visualize what had actually happened. The relationship between artillery and infantry in the First World War is one of the most extensively studied aspects of the conflict, and yet certain dimensions of it remain consistently under-examined. The simple truth is that a significant proportion of the casualties suffered by advancing infantry during the major offensives of the war were caused by their own artillery. Shells fell short. Barrage timings were miscommunicated. Infantry advanced faster than anticipated and walked into their own supporting fire. These incidents of friendly fire were documented in after-action reports with the same administrative neutrality applied to all other casualties. The causes were analyzed, adjustments were recommended, and then the next offensive produced similar incidents with similar administrative documentation. Men were killed by the weapons of the same army that had conscripted them, equipped them, and sent them forward into positions specified by staff officers working from maps that in many cases did not accurately reflect the current reality of the ground. The staff officers deserve particular examination. The image of the First World War staff officer working from a comfortable chateau miles behind the front line has become a cultural cliché that contains more truth than military historians have always been comfortable acknowledging. The physical separation between the men who planned operations and the men who executed them was not incidental to the nature of the war. It was structural. The army was too large, the front too long, and the communications technology too primitive to allow operational commanders to exercise real-time control from the front. Commanders had to remain at a distance from the fighting in order to receive reports, process information, and issue orders. That organizational necessity produced a command culture in which the experience of combat was entirely mediated by paper, an operation that in reality was a catastrophe of mud and machine guns and collapsing advances, looked on a staff map like a series of notations, arrows moved slightly forward or slightly backward, casualty figures entered in columns, objectives marked as taken or not taken. The men behind the maps were not monsters. They were administrators of violence working with the tools and concepts available to them. But the administrative remove at which they worked was not merely a practical inconvenience. It was a moral insulator. It made it possible for commanders to order the resumption of offensives that had already produced catastrophic casualties without experiencing any sensory connection to what those casualties meant in human terms. The letters sent home by soldiers from the Western Front are among the most extensively studied primary sources in First World War history, and they contain a paradox that has never been fully resolved. On one hand, many of the letters are remarkable for their emotional honesty, for the way men found language to describe experiences that had no precedent in civilian life. On the other hand, the letters were censored. Not by the men themselves, though self-censorship was pervasive and powerful, but by their officers, who were required to read and approve correspondence before it was dispatched. The practical effect of this censorship was not primarily to eliminate military intelligence, though that was its stated purpose. The practical effect was to eliminate any communication that might undermine public support for the war at home. References to the actual conditions of the trenches were removed. Descriptions of the failures of specific operations were removed. Expressions of hopelessness, of disillusionment, of hatred for the war itself were removed. What reached the families waiting at home was a filtered version of their sons and husbands, a version that had passed through the hands of a system designed to maintain a narrative of purposeful suffering. The families were not passive recipients of this censorship. Many of them understood at some level that the letters they were receiving were not complete representations of what was happening. The gap between the official accounts in the newspapers and the occasionally glimpsed reality in a soldier's letter before a phrase was cut or a page removed was perceptible to intelligent readers. But the social pressure to accept the official narrative was enormous. To doubt the war publicly was to suggest that the men who had died in it had died for nothing. And that was a position that the culture of the time made psychologically very nearly impossible for bereaved families to occupy. The grief and the patriotism were bound together in a way that made questioning the war feel like a betrayal of the dead. This fusion of grief and ideology was not accidental. It was cultivated by government information offices that understood perfectly well how it worked. The physical condition of men returning from the front, on leave or permanently, was one of the most poorly documented aspects of the war's effect on the home population. Men who came back on leave were expected to behave normally, to attend social functions, to interact with their families in ways that preserved the fiction of manageable experience. Men who had difficulty performing normalcy, men who startled at loud sounds or refused to speak about their experiences or sat for hours staring at nothing, were creating problems for the social machinery that required them to embody something presentable. The emotional reality of the men, the things they had seen and done and smelled and heard, and continued to see and hear in the form of involuntary memory during their leave, was not discussable in polite society. It was not discussable with their wives. It was not discussable with their parents. The men who talked about it were considered to have had their nerves badly affected, which was true in a clinical sense, but was also a way of placing their experience outside the range of normal discourse so that normal discourse could continue. The relationship between the First World War and the bodies of the soldiers who fought it goes beyond the obvious dimensions of wound and death. The war conducted experiments on bodies at a scale and with a systematic thoroughness that contemporary medicine would recognize as defining the trajectory of trauma surgery for the next century. The volume of wound types, of blast injuries, of gas casualties, of head wounds inflicted by shell fragments at velocities and angles that peacetime medicine had no experience with, generated a medical database of staggering scope. Surgeons learned things on the Western Front that they could not have learned in any other context, because the context was producing injuries at a rate that made a learning curve steep enough to be measured within weeks rather than years. The knowledge was genuinely valuable. Some of the reconstructive techniques developed during the war for managing facial disfigurement, for managing the loss of limbs, for managing the long-term neurological consequences of head wounds, became foundations of modern medicine. The fact that this knowledge was purchased with the systematic destruction of hundreds of thousands of human bodies is not a detail that the medical history of the period has consistently chosen to emphasize. Gas warfare is one of the aspects of the First World War most reliably described in general histories, and it is described with a consistent emphasis on its novelty, its horror, and the eventual development of countermeasures that reduced its effectiveness. What is less consistently described is the bureaucratic structure through which gas was developed, approved, deployed, and reported. The use of chlorine gas by German forces at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915 produced a shock among Allied commanders that was genuine and immediate. It also produced a decision-making process that moved with remarkable speed toward the conclusion that the appropriate response to gas warfare was to develop and deploy better gas. The moral debate about whether chemical weapons represented a qualitative departure from acceptable practice was conducted briefly and then closed. The practical question of how to make more effective gas and how to deliver it in ways that maximized its casualties was classified as an operational priority. Chemists were recruited from universities. Factories were converted to production of chemical agents. The entire institutional apparatus of industrial chemistry was bent toward the production of substances designed to destroy human respiratory systems, cause blistering of skin and mucous membranes, and produce deaths that the war's own medical personnel described in language that even within the necessarily clinical register of official reports occasionally broke through into something that sounded like distress. Phosgene, which was responsible for a large proportion of gas deaths in the war, caused a delayed reaction. Men who had been exposed to the gas sometimes felt relatively well for 24 to 48 hours before the chemical damage to their lung tissue manifested in the form of pulmonary edema, the flooding of the lungs with fluid which produced drowning from within. Men who appeared to be recovering, who had been moved back through the evacuation chain to clearing stations or base hospitals, died there, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes in ways that confused their medical attendants about the actual cause, because the exposure had occurred so far back in the chain that the connection was not immediately apparent. The paper trail of gas casualties was therefore incomplete, not because of deliberate concealment, though deliberate concealment of casualty figures was a real phenomenon, but because the administrative machinery was not always capable of connecting a death that occurred at a base hospital with an exposure that had occurred at the front line days earlier. Mustard gas, introduced by Germany in 1917, was different from the respiratory agents in important respects. It was a persistent agent, meaning it contaminated ground, equipment, and clothing for extended periods and continued to cause casualties among men who had not been present during the original deployment. It caused blistering of the skin, particularly in areas where skin was in contact with saturated clothing, and severe damage to the eyes, and it incapacitated rather than killed in the majority of cases, which from a purely military calculation made it more effective than a lethal agent, because an incapacitated man consumed medical resources that a dead man did not. The men who were blinded by mustard gas, temporarily or permanently, constituted one of the war's large populations of injured who required long-term care in facilities that had not been designed for them and under the management of a system that had not anticipated the scale of their numbers. The blindness hospitals established in Britain during and after the war were genuine institutions of care, staffed by dedicated personnel. They were also evidence of a gap between the optimistic capacity projections of the Army's medical planners and the reality of what the Army's operations were producing. The French Army mutinies of 1917 are an event that appears in general histories of the First World War and is described with varying degrees of detail depending on the audience. What the general history typically conveys is that following the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive in April and May of 1917, French soldiers in numerous units refused to carry out orders to attack, that the mutinies were suppressed through a combination of courts-martial, executions, and the replacement of Nivelle with Pétain, who addressed some of the soldiers' grievances. The numbers typically given are that perhaps 54 soldiers were executed following the mutinies, out of considerably more who were sentenced to death, with commutations having been ordered for the majority. What the general history typically does not convey is the scale of what actually happened. At the peak of the mutinies, a majority of the French divisions on the Western Front were affected to some degree. Men were refusing to attack. They were not, in most cases, refusing to hold their positions, which is a distinction that reflects something important about the nature of the protest. These were not men who had abandoned the war. They were men who had decided that attacking under the conditions then prevailing was a form of institutional murder to which they were no longer willing to be compliant. They were willing to die if attacked. They were not willing to walk forward into machine guns on the basis of staff plans that had already failed in their essential premise. The suppression of the mutinies was handled by the French army with a speed and efficiency that reflected institutional priorities. The executions were conducted. The ringleaders were identified and punished. The remaining men were returned to their positions. Pétain's reforms addressed conditions in ways that were real, but carefully limited. Improvements to leave schedules, improvements to food, promises about the operational tempo that were partially kept. The fundamental question of whether the war itself was worth the cost at which it was being purchased was not a question the institutional response was designed to address. It was not a question that could be addressed within the institutional framework, because the institutional framework had no mechanism for asking it and no mechanism for receiving an honest answer. The German army's experience of the war's psychological costs was in many respects parallel to the Allied experience, but the institutional response differed in ways that reveal something about how different military cultures processed the same underlying reality. The German concept of war neurosis, Kriegsneurose, was dealt with through a system that in some respects was harsher than its British equivalent and in other respects was more clinically sophisticated. German neurologists, including Max Nonne, developed treatments based on hypnosis and suggestion that produced rapid, apparent cures. Men who had been trembling and mute for months suddenly able to speak and stand and perform. The rapid cure was an institutional priority because the rate of neurological casualties was threatening to consume medical resources. Whether the cures were genuine in any lasting sense was a question the system was not particularly organized to answer, because the men who were rapidly cured were rapidly returned to the line, and what happened to them subsequently was recorded, if at all, in casualty returns that did not specify the prior history of neurological treatment. The German army's use of Hindenburg and Ludendorff as the effective commanders of the war effort from 1916 onward produced a military command structure with unusual characteristics. The two men exercised a degree of control over not just military but economic and political decision-making that was unprecedented in German history. The demands they made on German industry, German agriculture, and the German civilian population for the continuation of the war effort were enormous. The Hindenburg program, implemented in 1916, reorganized German industrial production for total war in ways that produced genuine gains in military output and simultaneous severe deterioration in the living conditions of the German civilian population. Food rationing became progressively more stringent. The turnip winter of 1916 to 1917, when the German potato crop failed and turnips became a primary caloric source for urban populations, produced malnutrition, on a scale that was documented in mortality statistics, showing increased deaths among children and the elderly. These civilian deaths were a direct consequence of the decisions made by a military command that had prioritized the operational requirements of the army over the nutritional requirements of the population the army was theoretically fighting to defend. The British blockade of Germany, which contributed significantly to the deterioration of German civilian food supply, was itself a subject of careful management in British official communication. The blockade was legal under international law as interpreted by Britain. It was also producing civilian casualties in Germany that British officials were aware of and that were in some internal assessments considered a feature of the blockade's effectiveness rather than an unfortunate side effect. The targeting of an enemy civilian population through economic strangulation was a form of warfare that did not involve artillery or gas, and therefore did not trigger the same moral responses that more visibly violent methods produced. It was warfare by spreadsheet and shipping manifest, conducted by men in offices who never saw the German children whose caloric intake was being systematically reduced by the administrative decisions those men were making. The distance between decision and consequence was even greater than on the Western Front. The harm was more diffuse, more slow-moving, harder to attribute directly to specific choices. It was easier to administer precisely because it was harder to see. The experience of non-European soldiers in the First World War is one of the most comprehensively understated dimensions of the conflict in the standard historical accounts. Britain deployed troops from India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, and the territories of its African empire. France deployed troops from West Africa, North Africa, and Indochina. These men served in the same trenches, under the same conditions, with frequently less adequate equipment and consistently lower pay than their European counterparts. They died at rates comparable to or exceeding those of European soldiers. They received medical care that was in systematic ways inferior to the care provided to white soldiers. They were subject to administrative policies that reflected the racial assumptions of the imperial powers in ways that were explicit in the documentary record, embedded in pay scales, leave policies, medical prioritization, and the language of the official reports describing their service. The Indian Army's contribution to the early campaigns on the Western Front in 1914 and early 1915 has been acknowledged in general histories, but the acknowledgment tends to emphasize the bravery and effectiveness of Indian troops rather than the specific ways in which those troops were managed within a system that treated them as interchangeable with each other in ways that reflected racial categorization. Letters home from Indian soldiers were censored by British officers who could read neither Urdu, nor Punjabi, nor the other languages in which the letters were written, and who relied on translators whose translations were then reviewed for content considered problematic. The cultural context of the letters, the specific ways in which South Asian soldiers processed the experience of industrial warfare through frameworks entirely different from those available to European soldiers, was largely invisible to the administrative apparatus through which their service was processed. The West African soldiers who served in the French army under the rubric of the tirailleurs sénégalais came from territories conquered by France within the preceding generation, and were in some cases the sons or nephews of men who had fought against French forces during the colonial wars. They were conscripted through processes that in rural communities were often experienced as indistinguishable from the slave raids that had preceded French colonialism by centuries. They arrived in France speaking little or no French, without the benefit of any cultural preparation for the environment they were entering, and were assigned to units commanded by French officers whose understanding of the men under their command was mediated entirely by colonial racial ideology. They died at the front, they were wounded, they were gassed, and their deaths and wounds were recorded in the same administrative systems that recorded the deaths and wounds of French metropolitan soldiers. Their names appear in the casualty records. Their experience does not appear in the narrative records with anything approaching comparable depth. The role of propaganda in sustaining the First World War is well documented and frequently discussed. And what is less frequently discussed is the specific machinery through which propaganda was developed and deployed in the major belligerent nations. and the direct connections between that machinery and the governmental decision-making apparatus that was simultaneously managing the war. The British War Propaganda Bureau, established in 1914 and operating from Wellington House in London, worked through a network of prominent writers, academics, and journalists who produced material designed to influence both domestic and neutral foreign opinion. The system was designed to be invisible. The Bureau's involvement with the material it was sponsoring was concealed. Articles, pamphlets, and books that appeared to be independent intellectual assessments of the war were in reality products of a coordinated government information operation. The authors involved included some of the most prominent literary and intellectual figures in Britain. Many of them believed in the cause they were writing for. Many of them had not been to the front. The gap between the war they were describing and the war that was being fought was not a product of deliberate dishonesty in most cases. It was a product of the information environment in which they were working, an environment carefully managed to ensure that the information they had access to was the information the government wanted used. The stories about German atrocities in Belgium, some of which were true, some of which were embellished, and some of which were fabricated, that formed a central part of British war propaganda in 1914, deserve attention not as examples of the manipulation of public opinion, though they were that, but as evidence of something more fundamental. The stories were believed because the people who encountered them wanted to believe them. The desire to believe that the enemy was uniquely barbaric, that the war being fought was a defense of civilization against savagery, was a desire that the institutional propaganda apparatus did not need to create. It needed only to channel and amplify what was already present. The most effective propaganda has never been the kind that inserts new beliefs into unwilling minds. It has always been the kind that confirms and intensifies beliefs the audience already holds. The British public in 1914 held beliefs about German militarism and about the British Empire's role as a civilizing force in the world that made them receptive to a specific kind of story about the war. The propaganda machinery delivered that story efficiently. The cost of maintaining that story for 4 years, the ongoing suppression of information that did not fit the narrative, the ongoing management of casualty information, the ongoing censorship of personal correspondence, the ongoing cultivation of a public culture in which questioning the war was made to feel like a form of moral failure, was borne by the men in the trenches who were the subjects of the story rather than its audience. The treatment of prisoners of war in the First World War occupies an unusual position in the conflict's historical record. The major belligerent nations were all signatories to the Hague Conventions, which established minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners. Those minimum standards were variously observed and violated throughout the conflict in ways that followed patterns related to the operational circumstances and cultural assumptions of the capturing force, rather than to principled adherence to international law. German prisoners held by Britain in the United Kingdom were generally treated in accordance with convention standards and lived in conditions that, while not comfortable, were not systematically murderous. Prisoners held in work camps behind the front lines on both sides lived in conditions that varied enormously and were in some cases lethal, not through deliberate killing, but through the familiar mechanism of bureaucratic indifference applied to people who had been defined as outside the circle of institutional concern. The captured men who suffered most severely were often those held in temporary facilities immediately behind the front lines during periods of intense combat, when the administrative capacity to manage prisoners was overwhelmed by the operational demands of the battle. Men captured during a major offensive might spend days in hastily constructed enclosures without adequate food, water, or shelter before the system had time to process them. The mortality rate during these initial periods of capture was in some cases significant. The records of these deaths were incomplete, and the causes of death were categorized in ways that attributed them to wounds rather than to the conditions of captivity, which was sometimes accurate and sometimes not. The relationship between the First World War and money has been studied extensively by economic historians and is rarely integrated into the general narrative accounts of the conflict in ways that illuminate what it reveals about the war's nature. The war was financed on a scale that had no precedent in human history. Britain borrowed heavily, both domestically through war bonds and internationally, primarily from the United States. The debt created by the war was so large that it constrained British government policy for decades afterward and contributed directly to the political and economic conditions that produced the Depression and the Second World War. The men who died in the trenches died not just as subjects of their nations, but as debtors, in the sense that their deaths were being purchased on credit, and the repayment of that credit would fall on the surviving population and on subsequent generations. The abstraction of national finance and the physical reality of men dying in mud are not usually presented together. Presenting them together reveals something important about the war's logic. The war was sustainable as long as credit was available to finance it. The human cost was not a constraint on the continuation of the war. It was a variable being managed within a financial framework that had its own imperatives. The war bond campaigns in Britain, France, and Germany appealed to citizens not just as patriotic investments, but as financial instruments that would eventually be repaid. People lent their savings to their governments in exchange for interest-bearing certificates and the understanding that after the war, the principal would be returned. The governments borrowed this money to pay for shells and rifles and the administrative cost of managing millions of men in uniform. The shells were fired. The men died or were wounded. The debt remained. The post-war economic settlements, including the reparations imposed on Germany at Versailles, were in part an attempt to make the financial mathematics of the war work out, to transfer the debt burden in ways that would allow the victorious nations to meet their obligations to their own citizens while punishing the defeated nation for the cost of the conflict. The mathematical impossibility of those reparations in the long run is a matter of historical record. What is less consistently noted is that the reparations negotiations were conducted by men using concepts of financial accountability that could not accommodate the full dimensions of what had been lost. The dead could not be compensated. The shattered minds and destroyed bodies of the survivors could not be entered as liabilities on a balance sheet. The calculation was already incomplete before it began. The armistice negotiations of November 1918 produced an end to the fighting, but the manner in which they were conducted and the terms under which they were agreed have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. The German army in November 1918 was in a state of operational collapse that was not fully visible from outside, partly because the German High Command had managed information about the army's condition with the same efficiency it had always applied to unwelcome facts. The army was retreating. Divisions were under strength. Morale had deteriorated dramatically. But the army had not been destroyed on German soil, had not been visibly defeated in a way that was legible to the German public. The armistice was agreed before the fighting reached Germany. German soldiers returned home through their own lines rather than through territory occupied by the enemy. And into this situation stepped a narrative that would have consequences of an entirely different order from anything the First World War itself had produced. The narrative that the German army had not been defeated militarily, but had been betrayed by forces at home, the stab in the back legend, the Dolchstoßlegende, was politically convenient for the same military commanders who had made the decisions that led to Germany's defeat. It provided an explanation for the war's outcome that did not require accountability from those who had directed the war. It transferred blame to civilians, to socialists, to Jews, to anyone except the staff officers whose plans had consumed the German army over 4 years of attritional warfare. The lie was deliberate. It was effective. Its consequences are part of a subsequent history that belongs to a different set of numbers than the First World War itself produced, but whose roots are embedded directly in the managed silence of November 1918. The demobilization of the armies at the end of the First World War was conducted with the same organizational logic that had characterized the mobilization 4 years earlier. Men were processed through systems designed to handle them in volume. They received documents, they were examined medically, they were issued civilian clothes if they required them. and they were released into a civilian society that had been significantly transformed by 4 years of war, but that was not organized to receive millions of men simultaneously carrying experiences that had no civilian equivalent. The transition support available to returning soldiers in 1918 and 1919 was minimal by any standard. The pension systems that were meant to compensate men for wounds and disabilities were underfunded and administered through bureaucratic processes that required applicants to demonstrate the connection between their current condition and their wartime service in ways that many men, particularly those with psychological rather than physical injuries, were unable to satisfy. Men whose hands shook or who woke screaming at night or who could not work in confined spaces or who were unable to function within the ordinary social structures of civilian life, without the particular social simplifications of military hierarchy, were assessed as having conditions that could not be confirmed as service-related and were therefore ineligible for the support designed for men whose conditions could be confirmed. The suicide rate among veterans in the years following the war was not systematically tracked. The depression, the alcohol dependency, the domestic violence, the social isolation that characterize populations of traumatized men who receive no treatment and are expected to perform normalcy were absorbed by families, by communities, by the public health statistics of the post-war years in ways that attributed them to individual pathology rather than to the collective injury of an industrial war. The men who died by their own hands in the 1920s and 1930s do not appear in the casualty figures of the First World War. They appear, if at all, in the records of local registrars who recorded cause of death without context, in coroners' reports that used the language of individual tragedy rather than systemic consequence. The graves of the First World War are the most visible physical legacy of the conflict, and the work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, established during the war itself and responsible for the maintenance of the cemeteries that now dot the former battlefields of Belgium and France, is genuinely impressive as an act of memorialization. The rows of identical headstones, the carefully maintained grass, the registers of the dead available for consultation represent a commitment to individual commemoration that seems to contradict the war's central tendency toward treating men as interchangeable. But the uniformity of the headstones is also a product of a deliberate policy decision. In the debate about how to commemorate the dead, one option was to allow families to bring their sons home and bury them in their own country. That option was rejected. The official rationale was equality, the idea that officers should not be returned to family graves in English churchyards while enlisted men remained buried in France. The practical effect was to maintain the cemeteries as memorials to the war, as an institutional enterprise rather than as collections of individually mourned losses. The dead remained in France and Belgium in ranks as organized in death as they had been in life, under the administration of a commission that maintained the grass and replaced damaged headstones and recorded the names of those whose graves could not be found in the registers of the missing, which are long. The soil of the former Western Front still contains an extraordinary quantity of unexploded ordnance from the First World War. Farmers in Belgium and northern France regularly plow up shells, grenades and other munitions that were buried in the fighting and have remained in the ground for more than a century. The phenomenon is known informally as the iron harvest, and it is not a curiosity. Belgian and French disposal units that remove this material from the fields process hundreds of tons of it every year. Some of it remains dangerous. Some of it contains gas agents that have degraded in ways that make them unpredictable. Men have been killed in the 20th and 21st centuries handling material that was buried in the ground during a war that ended in 1918. The war continues to produce casualties. It produces them without fanfare, without official recognition, without any administrative machinery specifically designed to count them as war deaths rather than agricultural accidents. The paperwork that generates does not connect them to the decisions made in the years between 1914 and 1918. The accounting that would be required to do so has never been considered necessary. The Spanish influenza pandemic that swept through the armies and then through the global civilian population in 1918 and 1919 killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, figures that exceed even the most comprehensive estimates of the First World War's direct military and civilian dead. The pandemic did not originate in Spain, which was neither a belligerent nor a particularly significant vector of transmission. Spain became associated with the disease in name because it was neutral, its press was uncensored, and it therefore reported on the outbreak honestly at a time when the belligerent nations were suppressing information about the disease in their own military forces to avoid affecting morale. The suppression of information about the influenza in the armies of Britain, France, Germany, and the United States in 1918 directly contributed to the pandemic's spread, because men who were sick were moved through the transport systems of the military precisely when isolation would have slowed transmission. The military's need to keep moving men, to keep filling the line, to keep the operational machine functioning, overrode the public health response that the scale of illness required. The war produced the pandemic not in a biological sense, but in an institutional sense. The conditions of mass mobilization, of men living in close quarters with degraded immune systems in nutritionally compromised bodies, created the conditions in which the virus thrived. The administrative decision to maintain operational tempo, despite clear evidence of serious illness spreading through units, provided the vector for global spread. The pandemic is categorized separately from the war in most historical accounts. The separation is administratively convenient and epidemiologically misleading. The peace treaties that ended the First World War, of which the Treaty of Versailles applied to Germany and was by far the most consequential, were negotiated at Paris in 1919 by representatives of the victorious powers who arrived carrying both genuine intentions and the full weight of domestic political pressures that had been generated by 4 years of managed public emotion about the war. The British and French publics had been told for years that the war was being fought for justice, for the protection of civilization, for the punishment of German aggression. The populations of both countries had lost hundreds of thousands of their sons and husbands and fathers. The political pressure on their representatives at Paris to ensure that the peace treaty reflected the magnitude of that loss in the form of German suffering was enormous, and was not merely cynical manipulation by political leaders. It reflected genuine grief and genuine anger that had been cultivated for years by institutional apparatus and was now difficult to contain or redirect. The result was a treaty that imposed terms designed to satisfy a domestic emotional need rather than to create a stable international order. The economic reparations demanded of Germany were calibrated not to what Germany could pay without destroying its economy, but to what seemed proportional to what the Allies had suffered. Those are different calculations that in practice produced incompatible outcomes. The men who negotiated the Treaty of Versailles were in some cases aware that the terms they were agreeing to were economically unsustainable and politically dangerous. John Maynard Keynes, who attended the Paris conference as a British Treasury representative and resigned in protest before its conclusion, published a devastating analysis of the treaty's economic assumptions that predicted with considerable accuracy the consequences that would follow from imposing the reparations burden on Germany. His prediction was not acted upon. The institutional momentum behind the treaty was too great. The political investment in its terms was too large. The grief of the populations who had lost the most was too raw to be redirected toward calculations about long-term stability. The treaty was signed. Its consequences, which include the political conditions that produced Adolf Hitler, the German rearmament of the 1930s and the Second World War, are part of a historical chain whose first link was forged in the managed silence and systematic deception of the years between 1914 and 1918. The reckoning that the First World War should have produced, a genuine confrontation with what industrial warfare meant for the future of civilization, was replaced by a treaty designed to look like reckoning and that functioned instead as a deferred disaster. The monuments erected after the First World War in cities and towns across the British Empire, France, Germany, and the other belligerent nations represent one of the most remarkable collective exercises in public grief in human history. The war memorials on village greens, in church vestibules, on the walls of schools and public buildings, bearing the names of the local dead, were genuine expressions of community loss. They were also, in their design and their inscriptions, instruments for framing that loss within a narrative that had been carefully managed since the beginning of the conflict. The inscriptions on British war memorials typically employ language of honor, sacrifice, and duty. They describe the dead as having given their lives, a phrase that implies agency and willingness rather than lost their lives, which implies circumstance, or had their lives taken, which implies agency on the part of those who directed them into positions where they died. The choice of language was not always conscious, but it reflected assumptions embedded in the culture of commemoration about how the war should be understood by those who survived it and by subsequent generations who would read the stones. The dead, translated by the inscriptions into willing sacrifices for a cause, became available for use as rhetorical instruments in subsequent arguments about duty and national service that had nothing directly to do with their actual experience. The most famous British memorial to the missing, the Thiepval Memorial on the Somme, bears the names of approximately 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died on the Somme between 1916 and 1918 and whose bodies were never identified. 72,000 men whose remains are somewhere in the ground of the Somme Valley but cannot be individually located or named. The memorial is architecturally impressive. The names, carved in stone in columns covering every surface of the structure, are individually legible and create an effect of overwhelming multiplication that is the closest the monument comes to representing the scale of the loss it commemorates. What the monument cannot represent, and makes no attempt to represent, is the process by which 72,000 men became unidentifiable, the shell fire that destroyed bodies beyond recovery, the mud that swallowed men entirely, the administrative chaos of large-scale offensives that lost track of where specific men had been when they died, the decomposition that made identification of remains found later impossible. All of this is absent from the monument. The monument presents the outcome without the mechanism. The names in stone replace the explanation of why the names were cut in stone rather than painted on wooden markers above graves. The literature that emerged from the First World War, the poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, the prose of Henri Barbusse and Ernst Junger, the memoir writing that continued for decades after the armistice, constitutes one of the most sustained literary responses to catastrophe in Western cultural history. The poetry especially has been taught in schools across the English-speaking world for a century and is widely considered to constitute an accurate moral account of what the war actually was. But the relationship between the literary record and the full reality of the war is more complicated than the canonical status of these works might suggest. The poets who are most remembered were officers. They were educated men with literary training and social connections that made their work publishable. They wrote from a particular position within the war's hierarchy, a position of relative privilege compared to the men they commanded. Their accounts of the war, however genuinely appalled, however artistically powerful, are accounts filtered through a specific social and educational formation that shaped what they saw, what they responded to, and what they were able to articulate. The millions of men who were not officers, who did not have literary training, who did not have the connections to get their work published even if they had written it, left a thinner textual record. What they thought, how they processed what they experienced, what words they would have used if they had written them down, is largely unavailable to us. The literary history of the war is a history of a particular slice of the war's participants, and the tendency to treat that slice as representative of the whole is itself a form of the class-based, selective attention that characterized the institutions that ran the war. The veterans' organizations that formed after the First World War in Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere served genuine functions of mutual support and political advocacy. They also served functions that were not always visible to their members. The large veterans organizations were cultivated by governments precisely because they represented concentrated and organized political forces that could be directed. The British Legion, founded in 1921 under the patronage of Field Marshal Earl Haig, who had commanded the British Expeditionary Force through the worst years of the Western Front, embodied the contradiction at the core of post-war commemoration. The man who had ordered the offensives that killed or maimed millions of British soldiers was honored as the organization's patron. Men who had survived those offensives joined an organization that celebrated him. The psychological work required to maintain this arrangement, the sustained suppression of anger and the cultivation of a narrative in which suffering had meaning and commanders were worthy of respect, was work that the culture of commemoration demanded and that many veterans performed at significant psychological cost. Those who could not perform it, who found the celebration of Haig's memory insupportable, had fewer institutional homes. Their version of the war's meaning was less socially acceptable and therefore less visible. The interwar decades, the 1920s and 1930s, produced a gradual shift in public understanding of the First World War in Britain that moved from the initial narrative of noble sacrifice toward a more critical assessment. The war poetry became canonical. The memoirs of Graves and Sassoon and remarks All Quiet on the Western Front, though German, reached English-speaking audiences in translation and confirmed a view of the war as futile massacre that gained intellectual respectability. By the early 1930s, the dominant cultural narrative about the First World War in Britain had become anti-war in a way that had direct and paradoxical consequences for the political decisions that led to the Second World War. The lesson drawn from the First World War, the lesson that war was catastrophic and must be avoided at virtually any cost, produced an appeasement politics that applied the logic of 1914, that another war would be an unacceptable replay of the Somme to a political situation in the 1930s that was fundamentally different. The lesson learned from the war was learned imprecisely and applied inappropriately. The institutional failure of the war, the failure to ask honest questions about what the war meant while it was being fought, produced a subsequent failure to ask honest questions about what the lessons of the war actually required. The managed silence of the war years became, in the interwar period, a managed oversimplification, and the oversimplification had its own catastrophic consequences. The physical landscape of the former Western Front, the area of Belgium and northern France, where the fighting was most concentrated, was so thoroughly destroyed during the war that significant portions of it were deemed uninhabitable afterward. Areas designated as the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, encompassed land where the concentration of unexploded ordnance, chemical agent residue and human remains was so high that the French and Belgian governments concluded that rehabilitation was impossible. Some of these areas have never been returned to agricultural or residential use. They remain forested or fallow, a permanent geographic consequence of industrial warfare that is visible on maps of the region to this day. The villages that stood on this land before 1914 were not rebuilt. Their names appear on memorials and on the maps of the pre-war period. Some of them have small monuments where they once stood. There is nothing else. The war removed them completely, and the land has not recovered in the sense of returning to its previous function. The zone represents not a scar on the landscape, but an amputation. The administrative records of the First World War, the millions of documents generated by the armies, governments, medical services, legal bodies, and intelligence organizations of the belligerent nations were preserved with varying degrees of completeness, and have been open to researchers over the subsequent century with varying degrees of genuine transparency. The British records at the National Archives at Kew, the French military archives at Vincennes, the German archives that survived the Second World War, and the partition of the country and its reunification, these holdings are extensive. They are also incomplete. Documents were destroyed deliberately during and after the war. Documents were lost through the ordinary attrition of time and institutional disorganization. Documents were classified and remain classified. Documents were altered before preservation. The archive is not a neutral repository of what happened. It is the result of a century of decisions about what to preserve, what to release, and what to continue concealing. The history written from these archives is therefore the history that the archives permit to be written, which is not the same thing as the history of what actually happened. What was the First World War? It was an industrial process that consumed human beings at a rate that required the construction of new administrative systems to manage the scale of consumption. It was a political event that destroyed 4 empires and created a new map of the world. It was a medical event that defined the trajectory of surgery, psychiatry, and public health for the century that followed. It was an economic event that transferred global financial dominance from Europe to the United States and left the European powers indebted in ways that shaped every subsequent political decision they made. It was a cultural event that destroyed one set of assumptions about civilization and progress and did not replace them with anything comparably stable. And it was an administrative event, perhaps most fundamentally an administrative event, in which the bureaucratic management of death at scale was refined and normalized to the point where it could be continued for 4 years without any mechanism for stopping it coming into existence within the systems conducting it. The war did not end because the institutions running it developed the capacity for self-reflection. It ended because one side ran out of the material and human inputs required to continue. Germany's defeat was not a moral reckoning. It was an operational collapse. The institutional logic that had produced the war remained intact in the minds of the men who had directed it, ready to be applied again under different circumstances, to different numbers of people, in different configurations of national interest and industrial capacity, on a timeline that the armistice of November 11, 1918, did nothing to interrupt and everything to establish.